3 trillion barrels of oil. That number is larger than the proven reserves of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait combined. It's more oil than the United States has consumed in its entire history as a nation. And according to the United States Geological Survey, it's sitting right here in America, beneath the scrubland of Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. If that's true, why are we still importing millions of barrels from overseas every single day? Why do gas prices still swing wildly every time there's tension in the Middle East? Why does the word energy independence show up in every political speech but never seem to arrive? The deposits are real. The surveys have been done. The oil is there. That's enough oil to fill the Grand Canyon twice. So what's stopping us from using it? The Green River Formation stretches across roughly 25,000 square miles of the American West, most of it concentrated in the Pisces Basin of Colorado, the Uinta Basin of Utah, and the Green River Basin of Wyoming. In places, the oil shale deposits run so thick that a single drill site can pass through hundreds of feet of oil-bearing rock without hitting bottom. Geologists who've mapped the formation describe it as one of the most concentrated hydrocarbon deposits ever discovered on Earth. Saudi Arabia's Ghawar field, the largest conventional oil field in the world, holds an estimated 75 to 83 billion barrels of recoverable oil. By comparison, what lies beneath Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming contains an estimated 3 trillion barrels. That's not 3 times larger. That's roughly 40 times larger. In 2012, the U.S. Geological Survey published the 3 trillion barrel estimate in a peer-reviewed assessment. Within 2 years, it had been cited in 47 congressional hearings, most of them arguing against renewable energy investments. Surveys confirm it. Drill cores prove it. Maps document every square mile. But here's the part that doesn't show up in the headlines. None of that oil is flowing. Not a single barrel is being extracted commercially. And the reason why comes down to a single, critical distinction that changes everything. The confusion starts with 2 words that sound almost identical but describe completely different things. Shale oil is the resource that triggered America's energy boom over the last 15 years. It's conventional crude trapped in porous shale rock formations, and it flows out when you drill horizontally and fracture the rock with pressurized water. That's fracking. Tiny cracks and pores let the oil move, reach the wellbore, and come up to the surface. It's expensive, but it works. Companies extract millions of barrels this way every single day across North Dakota, Texas, and Pennsylvania. Oil shale is the opposite. Instead of flowing through the rock, the oil is chemically bound inside the rock itself, locked into a substance called kerogen. Kerogen is organic material that never finished turning into oil. It got stuck halfway through the geological cooking process and solidified into the mineral structure of the stone. Drilling won't release it. Pumping won't work. Fracturing the rock and hoping it flows accomplishes nothing, because there's nothing to flow. The only way to release the oil is to heat the rock to around 650 to 900 degrees Fahrenheit, for long enough that the kerogen breaks down and liquefies. Petroleum engineers who've spent careers studying the Green River Formation describe the challenge this way. What exists underground is a raw ingredient that might someday become an oil field if you're willing to bake the entire mountain. That difference between oil that flows and oil that's fused into stone is why 3 trillion barrels might as well be 3 trillion tons of gold sitting on Mars. The resource exists, but getting to it requires solving a problem nobody has ever solved at scale. Someone tried. Exxon launched what it called the Colony Shale Oil Project in 1980, targeting the Pisces Basin of western Colorado. The plan was to heat the rock underground using a network of retorts, giant ovens buried in the shale, and extract enough oil to prove the concept could scale. Exxon poured more than $5 billion into the effort, which by 1980s standards represented one of the largest single industrial investments in American energy history. Engineers built an entire company town to house the workers. Construction crews carved roads into the mountains. Processing facilities rose out of empty desert. At its peak, more than 2,000 people were employed on site, and the project was generating enough local economic activity that nearby towns expanded schools, built new housing developments, and planned for a future built on oil shale. Then on May 2nd, 1982, Exxon executives made a decision. The company announced it was shutting down the Colony project immediately. Workers showed up that Sunday morning to find termination notices. Some received telegrams. The entire operation was dismantled within weeks. Equipment was sold off. Facilities were abandoned. The town that had grown around the project collapsed. Local newspapers called it Black Sunday. Exxon never publicly detailed every reason for the shutdown, but the economics were clear. After spending billions and employing thousands, the company had not produced a single commercially viable barrel of oil. The break-even cost per barrel was climbing toward numbers that made the whole operation unsustainable. And that raised the question nobody at the ribbon-cutting ceremony had wanted to ask: what if the problem isn't solvable? The numbers told the story Exxon didn't want to publicize. Cost per barrel, $90 to $95. That's after factoring in mining, heating, processing, environmental controls, and infrastructure. That figure assumed everything went according to plan, which it never does. Meanwhile, in 1982, the global price of crude oil was hovering around $32 per barrel. By mid-decade, it had dropped below $15. Energy economists who study resource extraction describe this as the fundamental viability gap. If it costs you $95 to produce something the market will pay you $30 for, you don't have an oil field. You have a money incinerator. Even during the brief price spikes of the 1970s oil embargo, when crude hit $40 per barrel, the margins were too thin and too unstable to justify the scale of investment required. The math only worked if oil prices climbed above $95 and stayed there long enough to recover billions in upfront costs. That threshold became the invisible wall that every oil shale project has crashed into for the last 50 years. Crude has occasionally spiked above that number during geopolitical crises or supply shocks, but it never holds. Prices collapse back down, and anyone betting on sustained triple-digit oil gets wiped out. So even when the resource is real, even when the deposits are proven, and even when the technology exists to extract it, the economics kill the project before a single barrel reaches a refinery. Which raises the next obvious question: couldn't better technology solve this? Technology companies promised they had the answer. Rather than mining the rock and heating it above ground in giant retorts, the next generation of oil shale projects would use in situ conversion, heating the rock while it's still buried underground. The concept sounds elegant. Drill a grid of wells into the formation, insert electric heating elements, bake the rock at 650 degrees for 3 to 4 years, and pump out the liquefied kerogen. Shell Oil developed the most advanced version of this process and tested it in Colorado's Pisons Basin throughout the 2000s. More than a decade of refinement followed, with published results showing it could work at a pilot scale. Estonia provided the only real-world proof of concept. The country has operated commercial oil shale facilities since the 1920s, though their method involves strip mining and surface retorting rather than true in-situ heating. Still, Estonia's ability to produce roughly 7,000 barrels per day from oil shale kept the dream alive that someone, somewhere, could crack the code and make it profitable. Then, in 2013, Shell announced it was abandoning its Colorado project entirely. After investing an estimated $2 billion over more than a decade, executives walked away. The official statement cited economic and regulatory challenges, but the underlying problem was the same one that killed Exxon's effort 30 years earlier. The cost per barrel was too high, the timeline too long, and the risk too great. The technology worked in a controlled test environment, but scaling it to produce millions of barrels required an investment no company was willing to make when conventional oil remained cheaper and faster to extract, which meant the barrier wasn't just economic or technological anymore. The environmental cost turned out to be the deal breaker nobody wanted to discuss publicly. Extracting a single barrel of oil from shale requires approximately 3 barrels of water. That ratio doesn't account for the water needed to cool equipment, suppress dust during mining operations, or restore the landscape afterward. In a region where every drop is already spoken for, that demand is impossible to meet. Beneath the Green River Formation sits the Colorado River Basin, which supplies water to 40 million people across 7 states and irrigates roughly 5.5 million acres of farmland. The river is over-allocated by design, meaning the legal claims to its water exceed the actual flow in most years. Hydrologists who study the basin describe it as a system operating on borrowed time. Drought isn't the exception anymore. It's the baseline. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the 2 largest reservoirs in the United States, have both dropped to historically low levels, exposing intake pipes and forcing water managers to implement emergency shortage protocols. Adding industrial-scale oil shale extraction into that equation would require diverting water from cities, farms, or ecosystems that are already fighting over every gallon. Colorado's state water engineers ran the projections in the early 2000s and concluded that a commercial oil shale industry producing even a fraction of the formation's theoretical output would consume more water annually than the entire city of Denver. No allocation mechanism exists to make that possible without triggering legal battles that could paralyze the region for decades. The technology might work, and the economics might eventually pencil out, but the water isn't there. Which raises the question nobody in Washington wants to answer. If the oil can't be extracted, why does the talking point never die? Because the 3 trillion barrel figure does real work. It shows up everywhere, and it's almost always presented the same way. As proof that America doesn't need to worry about energy security, that we're sitting on a resource so vast it dwarfs the reserves of every OPEC nation combined. You'll find it in congressional testimony arguing against renewable energy investments, in think tank white papers pushing for expanded domestic drilling, and in political speeches promising energy independence. The American Petroleum Institute, the industry's largest lobbying group, has cited the Green River Formation in briefings to lawmakers for decades, often in the same breath as calls to roll back environmental regulations that supposedly stand between America and energy abundance. Politicians from both parties have picked up the talking point. During a 2012 Senate committee hearing, Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah told colleagues that his state alone held more recoverable oil than the rest of the world combined, a claim that made headlines and reinforced the narrative that scarcity was a myth invented by regulators. The Institute for Energy Research, a think tank funded in part by fossil fuel interests, published multiple reports between 2011 and 2015, describing the Green River deposits as a strategic asset being held hostage by federal land use policies. What none of these sources mention is the word that appears in every geological survey: technically recoverable. They cite the 3 trillion number as if it represents oil that could be pumped tomorrow if only the government would get out of the way. But that's not what the data says, and the people citing it know that. So what's the actual mechanism that turns a geological estimate into a political weapon? The distinction between those terms? That's where the entire illusion lives. Recoverable reserves are what oil companies can extract and sell profitably right now using existing technology and current market prices. Proven reserves, the gold standard of the industry, require even more certainty. Geological data confirming the oil is there, infrastructure in place to reach it, and a business case showing extraction will generate profit within a reasonable time frame. Technically recoverable reserves occupy a different category entirely. This term means the oil could theoretically be extracted if you ignored every economic constraint, if you had unlimited time and capital, if energy prices climbed high enough to justify any cost, and if technology improved enough to solve problems that don't have solutions yet. Energy analysts who evaluate reserve classifications for investment banks describe technically recoverable estimates as geological curiosities, not asset valuations. They're useful for understanding the total resource base trapped in a formation, but they carry no weight in determining whether a company should drill or whether a region can count on that oil to power its economy. Every assessment the U.S. Geological Survey publishes makes this distinction clear, defining technically recoverable resources as deposits that could be produced using current technology regardless of economic viability. That last phrase does all the work. Regardless of economic viability. It means the estimate assumes away the very factors that determine whether oil gets extracted in the first place. It's the equivalent of saying you're a millionaire because your basement contains 1,000,000 pennies, and you're technically capable of counting them all by hand. The resource exists. That doesn't mean you're rich. All 3 trillion barrels in the Green River Formation fall into that category, and the gap between technically recoverable and actually usable is where decades of hype have flourished unchallenged. A single source produced the figures everyone cites, and buried inside that report is the context that changes everything. The U.S. Geological Survey published its most comprehensive assessment of the Green River Formation in 2012, a 150-page technical report that every politician and lobbyist citing the 3 trillion barrel figure claims to have read. Most of them haven't made it past the executive summary. The number appears on page 4, formatted in bold text inside a table that lists total oil in place alongside estimates for what might be technically recoverable under various scenarios. What doesn't appear on page 4 is the footnote explaining what technically recoverable actually means in this context, or the caveats the survey's authors included to prevent exactly the kind of misuse that followed. Those details live on page 47, buried in a section titled Limitations and Uncertainties that reads like it was written by scientists who knew their work would be weaponized and wanted a paper trail proving they'd warned everyone. The report states clearly that technically recoverable estimates do not account for land access restrictions, water availability, infrastructure costs, or economic feasibility at any given oil price. It goes further, noting that the term applies to resources that could be extracted if all economic factors were ignored. That phrase appears verbatim in the text. The authors stress that their assessment provides no guidance on whether oil shale development is practical, profitable, or achievable within any realistic time frame. They're geologists, not fortune tellers, and they refuse to pretend their data justified conclusions it couldn't support. But that nuance evaporated the moment the 3 trillion figure entered public discourse, where it's been cited thousands of times without the disclaimers that came with it. The final question remains: if the caveats were right there in the original report, how much of that oil is actually usable? Under current technology and market conditions, less than 1% of the Green River Formation's oil is economically viable to extract. That translates to roughly 30 billion barrels, a figure that sounds massive until you compare it to the 36 billion barrels of proven reserves the United States already has access to through conventional drilling. Petroleum geologists who specialize in unconventional resources describe this 1% estimate as optimistic, contingent on oil prices staying above $90 per barrel for sustained periods and advances in extraction technology that remain theoretical. The gap between 3 trillion and 30 billion isn't a rounding error or a temporary setback waiting for the right breakthrough. It represents the difference between what exists in the ground and what can be turned into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel without bankrupting whoever attempts it. Even that 30 billion figure assumes obstacles that have killed every previous attempt, like water scarcity and infrastructure costs, can somehow be solved at scale. The United States Geological Survey's own analysts have noted in follow-up assessments that no significant portion of the Green River deposits should be counted toward national energy security planning, a conclusion that directly contradicts how the 3 trillion number gets used in policy debates. But policy debates don't run on geology, they run on headlines. So if the real, usable amount is a tiny fraction of what's claimed, and if scientists have been saying this for over a decade, why does the myth survive? The 3 trillion barrel figure survives because it offers something irresistible in political discourse: the promise of abundance without sacrifice. Politicians invoke it when gas prices spike. Think tanks cite it in reports arguing against renewable energy investment, and industry groups deploy it whenever regulations threaten their interests. This number does real work. It suggests America's energy problems are a matter of will rather than geology, that independence is just one policy change away, and that scarcity is a myth perpetuated by people who don't want us to thrive. Believing in 3 trillion barrels means never having to confront hard trade-offs about consumption, never having to accept that some resources cost more than they're worth to extract, and never having to question whether energy independence is even a coherent goal in globally integrated markets. Emotional comfort this provides is worth more than accuracy to the people who keep repeating it. But gaps between what's technically in the ground and what's actually usable reveal something deeper about how energy myths take root and spread. Most people never ask the follow-up questions. They hear a big number, feel reassured, and move on. Details that would complicate that reassurance, caveats buried on page 47, distinctions between recoverable and technically recoverable, stay buried because interrogating them requires admitting the problem is harder than the solution sounds. America does sit on an enormous oil deposit. That part is true. What we're sitting on just happens to be locked in rock that no one has figured out how to crack profitably in a region that doesn't have the water to support extraction, using technology that doesn't exist at prices the market won't bear. And until that changes, those 3 trillion barrels will stay exactly where they are, underground, out of reach, and doing more work as a talking point than they ever could as fuel.